This evening, I am very pleased to be able to introduce our speaker, Dr. Deborah Tate. She is quite an accomplished researcher, and some of you may have met Dr. Tate before. Has anybody here been working with her? Anybody been working? No, we've got a brand new crowd for you, Dr. Tate. That's terrific. Well, Dr. Tate has actually been working on a study in Kannapolis that she's going to tell us a little bit more about. And her specialty, her primary research interest, is in interventions for the prevention and treatment of obesity. And there are quite a few of us that struggle with this. And for those of us who do, we have a lot to learn. And I know that she's got some great insight to share. She is jointly appointed in the School of Public Health and the Departments of Health Behavior and Health Education and the Department of Nutrition at UNC Chapel Hill. She also has an appointment in the Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Center at Chapel Hill, and we're very pleased to have her here tonight to tell us a little bit more about her research and tell us a little bit more about the talk that she's prepared called Managing Your Weight, What Really Works. Please welcome me in joining Dr. Tate to Kannapolis.
Thank you, Beverly, and I'm thanking you all for coming out tonight. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk with you a little bit about the weight control research that we do, but also I'm going to be talking about the literature overall and the literature in general in terms of what kinds of strategies people can use. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, so I study the behaviors that are helpful for people in managing their weight, and we do a lot to change both the eating side, the behavior of eating, and the behavior of activity or exercise, and then a lot of other behavioral strategies that we employ when we try to help people manage their weight. So I'm going to be reviewing some of the evidence-based recommendations, sort of a status of where we are. In the process of doing that, I'll tell you a little bit about some original research that I've been doing, some of the strategies we've actually studied ourselves. Others are studies that come from the general literature. So we have a problem in our society. You all who have been coming to some of these talks have been talking about the problem of overweight and obesity in America. If you look at the infographic here, it's approaching, you know what? I'm sorry. I'm going to go back 2 seconds. I have two kinds of technology going on here, so I want to make sure that I get this right. But anyway, I'm going to be reviewing the evidence-based strategies. So on this infographic, you can see that about 68%, almost 70% of our population are classified as overweight or obese, and the red line represents adults, and the other lines represent other demographics, other age groups in America. And overall, what we've been noticing is that the prevalence of this problem has been increasing. And the reason that we think that much has happened in our own country over the past few decades has been related to some of the societal changes that have really escalated over probably the past 30, 40 years or so. I won't date myself too much, but if we think about our society overall, things have changed a lot since the beginning of the early 1900s in terms of how we get food. So thinking back in terms of if dinner was going to be on the table at night, there was a lot of physical activity, physical work, and labor that went into producing that food and preparing those meals. And so we have experienced a lot of change in the food availability that we have in our country. Today, we can go to grocery stores and get an expanse of many, many types of food and many, many varieties of those foods. So even just thinking back in your own lifetime, I know grocery stores were smaller. There were fewer of every item on the shelves. We're now overwhelmed with choice, and there's a lot of research going on what happens to us when we have so many choices of such highly palatable, delicious food that's available to us instantaneously. So our ability to get food year-round has really changed. And our ability to have that food almost everywhere that we go has changed. So thinking back, even I know some of us can remember to a time when you went to a gas station, and that gas station sold what? Gas. Did it sell Dunkin' Donuts? Did it sell Subway sandwiches? No, it might have sold a Coke or Pepsi in a small bottle out of a machine that was outside the gas station, or perhaps some candy or something else like that. But lots of places that didn't used to sell food now sell food readily and sell lots of food and give us lots of choices. So we have a lot of choice that's very easy for us to come by today that we didn't have before. So who knows what this is? I mean, everybody should hope, well, hopefully, although sometimes I see some younger people that may not actually know what this is, but this is a window crank in your automobile that people used to use to actually put the windows up and down, and instead of pushing a button so that the windows would lower and raise automatically. So I illustrate this because a lot has also changed in America on the side of the daily energy that we spend doing simple tasks. So if you think about from the time you get up in the morning until the time you go to bed at night, you can probably calculate a lot of energy that is saved in your day by modern conveniences that some generations ago would have meant a difference in the number of calories that were burned doing normal activities. Not calories that were burned doing physical exercise at the gym, but calories that were burned just living. Things like rolling up and down the windows in the car, things like getting off of the sofa to turn the TV channel or to turn the channel on or off, putting up the garage door, getting out of the vehicle to go purchase food, as opposed to driving through. Actually, maybe if you went to the certain right type of restaurant, someone would roller skate out to your vehicle to give you food, but most often you might have to get out of the vehicle and go into that establishment. And oftentimes we weren't going there very often. We were eating where? At home. So the amount of food that we were consuming, because studies have shown that the food that we eat when we eat out is more calories than the food that we eat when we eat at home. We weren't eating out as much, and we were spending a lot more calories to get that food and to be active during our day. So those things have changed how the energy balance in our bodies are kind of operating today. And what we talk about is the fact that everywhere we go, we are sort of bombarded with these very highly delicious foods that we see. And we know there's a principle in that's called stimulus control. So has anyone walked by a bakery, not necessarily hungry, but smelled delicious, freshly baked goods? And then, it would be delicious to go and have a pastry right about now that smells wonderful. That is a stimulus that prompts you or triggers you to think about eating at a time when normally you wouldn't. We're going to talk about that later. But because we have this, what we call ubiquitous food environment, where food is everywhere, and that food is typically larger and in more abundance for us, we have to be careful. And those of us in the obesity field call this a toxic environment. And you think about toxic environments as those that might be environmentally challenging, but in order to manage your weight today, it takes active thought and preparation in order to do so when we're surrounded by these different challenges. So we need to take action. We also think that we live in a toxic media environment where what's promised is quick fixes and things that are really physiologically not possible or likely. And so we have sort of this balance of a lot of things that make it challenging for us alongside this idea that, but it can be so simple or it can be so easy for you to manage your weight. So you might wonder with this kind of situation whether weight loss is actually possible for people living in this kind of environment. And I just want you to think for a minute before we jump into the data and the evidence-based strategies about a spa and a place where you might go where it was all of the foods were prepared for you in an appropriate calorie amount for your weight or your body, or to help you lose weight if you wanted to. You were able to exercise. You were entering this stress-free zone where you didn't have all of the demands of your family life, maybe your job or other things. So you could really focus on eating healthful meals, participating in physical activity, something like that. What do you think would happen if you went to a place like this where, chefs who are specifically trained and dietitians were working on giving you an appropriate amount of food and you were able to be physically active? You would lose weight if you went here, if you were choosing to do that, or you would maintain your weight. And this happens all the time in places like the metabolic unit that you have here, or in a hospital ward that's specifically set up, and people are fed the foods that are appropriate, and they don't have access to other foods all around them, and they have time to be active. So this idea that this can work is shown repeatedly over and over again. And places like the Biggest Loser Ranch, has anyone heard or seen this type of program? People go away, they leave their normal lives, they have all day to exercise, and they're fed very highly delicious, healthy foods in appropriate portions, and they're able to lose weight. So it's kind of the same thing when they go away to the Biggest Loser Ranch. It's not so easy when we're trying to do this or manage this at home, but there are some things that you can do to sort of manage your own environment to make it a little bit easier, and we can talk about what those recommendations are. There was a study that was actually just published in the Journal of Obesity in 2012 where they looked at how much exercise and what the average amount of food intake was being consumed at the Biggest Loser Ranch during the initial weight loss period. Because oftentimes you see pounds that are being lost, 5 pounds, 9 pounds a week or such, that we aren't normally expecting. We're normally expecting a weight loss of maybe 1 to 2 pounds per week for the typical person. And what they found is that the average calorie intake is about 1,300 calories per day, and they're doing 3.1 hours of vigorous exercise each day. So not moderate activity like brisk walking, but vigorous activity for 3.1 hours per day in order to see those kinds of weight losses. So it's a very carefully controlled environment that's producing these larger weight losses. So it is possible. And we know this because these are the same people when they go to the ranch that they were when they were at home. They have the same genetics, they have the same dieting history, and they have the same willpower, if you will. But what's dramatically different is all the challenges that they're faced with and the people that are around them and the situation that they're in. So that carefully controlled environment where other people are also doing those same things and they're getting a lot of encouragement, they're getting a lot of positive feedback from the trainers. Well, sometimes it's positive. They're getting a lot of, they're focused specifically on this, and they're getting a lot of help to do that. And so it makes it more possible. They're not under the same conditions that we're under. So in order to make weight loss possible, it requires pretty significant behavior changes. If we think about eating only 1,300 calories per day, like they were doing, and exercising so much, and really which of those changes have the most impact? We're going to talk tonight about the diet side and the exercise side. What has the most impact, or do we need both? And what does the research show? Do those changes have to be permanent? Is it possible to lose weight or even to maintain a healthy weight if you're trying not to gain weight? What kinds of things have we found are necessary, and do they have to be permanent? What changes are people more likely to stick to? So if you have some choices, we'll talk about some of those and what the research shows for different types of dietary approaches, and people can make some choices about what they might be more likely to stick to. And then we'll learn a little bit about some sort of additional evidence-based strategies that we're finding that you might be able to implement at home and actually set up your home environment for more success to take advantage of some of the newer approaches that we're learning about. So I'm going to talk about the evidence and go through each sort of area to help you see some of the research that has been published more recently and some that's a little bit older, but that is what we base all of our evidence-based guidelines on. So this idea that I keep coming back to, we call energy balance. And this is the idea that your weight is a balance between the energy you take in and the energy that your body uses. And in general, your body is looking to maintain a balance. And it's looking to kind of keep things at some point, to keep things in sort of what we call equilibrium. So if you're gaining weight and you're taking in too many calories for your body, you're going to gain weight over time. If you do the opposite, where you actually are taking in fewer calories than your body is using, and you can do this by exercising more, using more calories, taking in fewer calories, or both, this is when we have weight loss. So it's actually a pretty delicate balance to try to maintain your weight exactly where it is, because you're looking for an appropriate amount of calories and an appropriate amount of activity to keep things where they are. And we're going to talk about one simple tool that you can use that might be helpful to you in maintaining your weight if that's what you're interested in, and what the research is starting to suggest for what that might be. So I'm going to talk about things that are not too sexy, not too interesting, not too new, but they're the three foundations of managing your weight. The behavioral recommendations are based on three sort of pillars. One of them is energy balance, and if you're seeking to lose weight, you have to tip that balance. The second one is that in order to know whether you're in equilibrium, or whether you're tipping the balance, you have to do two things, we think. One is keep some sort of track, and we're going to talk about some different ways you might be able to do that. And the second is to weigh yourself. And we are now finding a lot of research that suggests that you need to weigh yourself frequently in order to understand whether this is working or not working, and being able to make adjustments to that. So I'm going to talk about some of the research behind these three recommendations before we go into some additional strategies that might be useful to you. So the first is that the research shows that creating an energy deficit is what is essential for weight loss. And you might have come to a variety of talks or been reading a lot about lots of different dietary approaches, but in essence, we're going to come back to the point that an energy deficit is what's going to be needed. And you can create that energy deficit a variety of ways with different dietary approaches, and we'll see that it's very challenging, but some can be done with exercise as well, not as much, but we'll look at that research. So you might wonder whether one approach is different than another. You've heard of lots of different approaches: Atkins, the Zone, Weight Watchers, Eat for Your Blood Type, you name it, paleo, all kinds of them. Paleo doesn't have as much research evidence yet behind it, but I'm going to talk about the ones that have the most research evidence. But there's lots of different approaches. And what you'll see is that when you really look at those approaches, they generally differ on the macronutrient content of those diets. So things like how much percent fat, percent carbohydrate, and percent protein. And I'm just showing you on this next slide, oops, I went backwards, sorry, there, that the differences in many of these diets, so the typical American diet, when they've measured in epidemiologic studies, is about 35% fat, 50% carbohydrate, and 15% protein. That's on the top line. And about 2,200 calories. So oftentimes you see on the back of the food label for a typical diet about 2,000 calories. That's where this comes from, sort of this idea that this is typical. It's not necessarily the appropriate amount of calories for each individual, okay? But that's what they're basing some of that on. And then there are other diets that generally differ. So if you think of something that might be a higher fat, lower carbohydrate, like the second line, that would have maybe only 10% carbohydrate, would have a higher ratio of fat, and maybe a moderate amount of protein, something like that. These can vary depending on which diet. So this is a generalization. If it's moderate fat, it's generally going to be lower than what's typical, so lower than a 35% or lower than a 30%, something like a 25%. And actually, a lot of research long ago showed that if you had people on the same calorie recommendation, if you gave one group a recommendation to also lower their fat intake, many studies showed that they did better. So that's where that early recommendation to lower fat intake came from. Many studies where people were randomized to the same calorie level, one with a lower fat recommendation, because fat is an expensive calorie. When people were watching their fat, they were eating fewer calories is what we think was happening in those studies, okay? It's more calories per gram for fat than the other nutrients. So those early recommendations where people thought you could eat, if it was fat-free, it was open to be eaten, were sort of based on this idea that you only had to watch fat. And sort of people know that that's not the case and you need to watch the total calories. But that's where those recommendations came from. So that's kind of a general weight loss diet you see there. And then the low or very low fat diets are things like the Ornish approach that they were looking at for reversing heart disease, going really low, or like vegan diets. So vegan diets I'm not going to talk about a lot tonight, but they show very good weight losses and long-term weight loss maintenance. They're typically very low fat diets. They would have like 13% fat, maybe 70% carbs, and maybe 17% protein. So many of the different diets vary these percentages of the different macronutrients, okay? What can you see, though, in that shaded box on the far side under calories for all those different variations of the macronutrients? They're typically about the same. And that's one of the bottom line messages from the research so far, is that most of these approaches, when people are eliminating certain foods or changing around this macronutrient content, is that the overall calories go down, and that's how the weight losses are produced. So they're about the same calories, and lower than the typical American diet of about 2,200 calories, or even higher, depending on what your starting weight or your initial weight was. So a study that looked at this was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association a few years ago, said, okay, let's put people on the Atkins, the Zone, Weight Watchers, sort of a typical low fat, and the Dean Ornish. Let's compare these diets. So they took 160 overweight adults, and they were about an average of 50 years old, half women, half men, and they wanted to randomly assign them to these different dietary approaches. They all exercised a similar amount, so that was equal across the groups, and they all took a multivitamin to ensure that they had some general level of similar micronutrient intake, and they didn't have any outside supports. They did meet with a dietitian and physician, so they had similar recommendations. They were all randomized sort of in typical real-world conditions to follow the dietary approach as closely as they could at the beginning, and then to do it to the best of their ability thereafter. So they really wanted them, no matter what, to stick with that dietary approach and eat exactly what was recommended as best as they could for the long term, but they knew that that was probably unlikely. So they really emphasized it at the beginning and then said, do as best as you can. And what they found, one of the main findings from this study, was that at 12 months, there was a trend. So it was a p-value of 0.08. And so if we're real sticklers, we say that that was just a trend. It wasn't 0.05, suggesting that it was highly significant, that the more extreme diets, so Atkins and the Ornish approach, compared to the more moderate, the Zone and the Weight Watchers, tended to have people dropping out a little bit more likely, were more likely to drop out. So some people found that too difficult, or it was too extreme for them to follow. The more moderate diets, people tended to stick with them a little bit more. It was a trend, but there was a finding that sort of suggested that. And the reasons were that they thought it was either too difficult, or they felt like it wasn't producing enough weight loss. So they said, forget this. I'm not going to keep doing this extreme diet. I'm going to drop out of the study. So here are the results, and you can see that the top bars are the attrition, or the dropout. And you can see that it was pretty high in those groups. Atkins, 48% didn't follow the diet anymore, and 50% in Ornish didn't follow the diet anymore, compared to 35% in Weight Watchers and 35% on the Zone. But the bottom line for weight loss, which is at the bottom, and those are in pounds at 1 year, was that they didn't find any statistically significant differences in the weight losses among the people who were following, quote unquote, those diets. So essentially, they were all producing some weight loss, and there weren't really any differences when people were trying to follow these approaches. Now, why might that be? Somebody said it, I think. So they were about the same amount of calories. So when they were trying to follow it, the amount of calories that they reduced on a per day basis, you can see 138 ranging from about 138 to 251 calories per day, was similar. So it was producing about the same amount of weight loss because even though there was a different way they were getting different calories, one was really not eating fat and one was really not eating carbohydrate, but they were not eating something. So the total calories were going down, okay? So that was a finding at 1 year. But they did find that it was somewhat difficult to stick to some of those diets, and the more restrictive. So the Ornish, which made you restrict almost all fat, 10% fat is pretty darn low, and the one that was restricting most all carbohydrates was difficult to follow for a whole year. So those more moderate diets were easier, a little bit easier for people to follow. So this next study was actually another randomized trial. I'm showing you this because it was one of the larger randomized trials. In your handout, it's slightly different. It's like 2 slides down, but just look for this graph. They had a low-fat diet, which was more like that Weight Watchers diet in the last one. It was just a typical low-fat. We reduced calories from fat down to 20 to 25% versus low-carb. Okay? And this study went out to 2 years. And what they found was after 2 years, people were regaining weight in both groups, and there was no difference in the two approaches. Okay? And likely, this is because the adherence or the sticking with it factor was similar for the two approaches. So sort of what can we take away from this? How can we implement this? A general strategy to reduce calories, there are many of these. And one of the things that seems to be important is how well you think you could stick with that approach. Okay? So some people are going to have a little bit easier time than others, and there are some other health benefits. Today I'm only talking about for managing weight. So in general, we know there's lots of other things that might go into choosing one of these approaches for a long-term way to eat. And I'm not going to talk too much about that now, but we can have some questions about that later if you'd like. But in general, if you want to do this for a short-term approach, it seems like they're all fairly similar short-term, and that you could pick one that you think you could do, and you might even switch. If you couldn't do that one for a while, you might be able to switch to another one, although none of these studies had people switching, so I can't say too much about that. Okay, so what about the exercise side of the equation? That was more a little bit about what you're eating. We know we have to create the deficit. So we could either eat less or we could exercise more. And we'll talk about doing both. So in general, the research shows there's accumulating evidence that doing about 225 minutes. You might have heard in the past, 150 minutes was sort of the recommendation for being physically active, 150 minutes a week that you could accumulate throughout the week. But for weight control, especially for long-term maintenance of weight loss, it looks like doing somewhere between 200 and 225 has the best evidence for long-term success. It's quite a lot, huh? 225 minutes? So some of this research comes from secondary data analysis. So this means on this slide, this study was published by Dr. John Jakisik, one of my colleagues who works at the University of Pittsburgh. We do some work together on another study, but this is one of his studies that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, where after the study, so not randomizing, but after the study, like you're looking at in epidemiology, they broke people into groups of how much exercise they did during the 18 months. Those who did more than 200 minutes had the best weight losses. You can see these are in kilograms on this slide, so multiply by 2.2 in your mind, or just multiply by 2, and you'll get the pounds. The group that did sort of in the middle, more than 150, but not quite 200, so more than those general health recommendations of 150, but not quite up to that 200, they were in the middle. And those who were doing less than 150, less than the general health recommendations, had the least weight loss and kept that weight off at a lower amount during the trial over 18 months. So the problem with this is that we don't know, because it's after the fact and they weren't randomized to do these amounts, we don't know if there's something about the people that choose to do 200 minutes or more that's just different, right? So we need a randomized trial, right, to see whether this makes a difference. We don't know. There could be something else. They also do something else, and so we don't know if it's really the exercise or something else about them. So that's what we did. Some of my colleagues and I conducted a study where we looked at randomizing people to a standard recommendation of about 1,000 calories per week, or about 10 miles of walking. You could sort of translate that into 10 miles of walking per week. So it's around that 150 recommendation. Maybe most people could do that in about 150 minutes. Versus a higher amount, 2,500 calories, which is around 25 miles of walking or thereabouts per week. So a higher exercise recommendation, or a little bit more than that 200 minutes, slightly more than that 200 minutes, or about 1,000 calories. So we randomized those in people in this study to both of those groups. And here's what we found. At 6 months, because in most studies when we do weight loss, they're all getting a diet, and then they're randomized to these different exercise amounts. And in most studies, over time, we don't start people out doing 2,500 calories of exercise or 25 miles of walking. We don't start out doing that with overweight and obese participants coming into a weight loss program. So we gradually increase as people are going along. So at 6 months, you see there's no difference in the two groups at 6 months. That's because they were doing about the same amount of exercise at 6 months. We had just gotten the 2,500 calorie group up to their 2,500 calories. And what you see is that they start to regain, but the group that is doing the high exercise in the clear box, HPA, high physical activity, they are regaining less. They're doing better and significantly better at 12 and 18 months than the lower exercise recommendation. So these are people who are randomized. Now I can show you that if I go back and do an analysis where I look, because not everybody in that high exercise group is getting up to that level, right? They're randomized and we're telling them to and we're helping them. They meet with coaches. They came in with friends, but they're not all getting there. When we went back and did an analysis just like that other one, when we saw the people who did that amount, their weight losses were beautiful and perfectly maintained. So doing really, really well, but not everybody can quite get there, right? So that's why it doesn't look exactly flat. So then we followed them out to 30 months. We didn't give them any more treatment. And we found that at 30 months, it's hard to see on this graph, but at 30 months, there's actually no difference between the groups. Why do you think that might be? They both were exercising the same. So the high exercise group couldn't keep up that high amount of exercise, and the exercise amounts of both of the groups at 30 months became similar. So their weight losses were similar. So at 12 and 18 months, when they were doing different amounts of physical activity, there was a difference. But as that gap closed, and again, we went back and looked at the people who maintained that higher level, they maintained and they still had really, really great weight losses. And incidentally, a lot of them were men. But we had small numbers of men, so we had a hard time looking at that, within the study. But many of them were men. Not all of them. Some of the men were not doing it either, but there were some that maintained 2,500 calories of exercise throughout the whole 30 months, and their weight losses were very good. So what if it's hard and you can't quite imagine, I'm going backwards on purpose, you can't quite imagine doing, let's say, 45 or 50 minutes all at one time? Could you break that up into segments during the day? There's actually a randomized study we called it short bouts, where they looked at, could you do short bouts of physical activity? Oops. So this is, again, another study by Dr. Jakisik, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, where they took 148 women in an 18-month study, and they randomized them to long bouts, which in this definition was about 45 minutes, well, about 40 minutes at a time when they got all the way up there. You'll see that that progressed over time. So they started out at 20 minutes at a time, and then over time got up to 40 minutes. Long bouts, short bouts, or short bouts plus equipment. So that's what the SBEQ is, short bouts plus equipment. So those people were really lucky in this study. They got treadmills in their house. So tell them here at the NRI that they'll get lots of research participants if they give people treadmills. So anyway, they got treadmills at their home, and they were randomized to do short bouts, long bouts, or short bouts plus having the treadmill at home. And they progressed from 20 minutes to 40 minutes over time. So short bouts in the beginning would be doing 2 10-minute bouts versus long bouts would be doing 1 20-minute bout. That's what that would look like at the beginning of the study. And at the end, it might look like 4 10-minute bouts, or it might look like 2 20-minute bouts. It would be broken up in the short bout group, and it would be doing all 40 minutes all at one time. Okay? So the amount of exercise, the dose, was equal, but how you got it, did you break it up, or did you have to do it all at one time, was different among the groups. And one group had a treadmill at home, with the idea of changing the home environment to make it easier to do that might make it more likely that they did it over time. That's why they had that group. So this again, this is just to show you they had they were on average about 38 years old in this one, and again, overweight or obese. Their body mass index was just about 32. Okay, so at 6 months, this is what you see here. There were no differences in the weight losses between the groups. So everybody lost the same amount of weight, whether you were in the short bouts, long bouts, or short bouts plus exercise at 6 months. What happened out to 18 months was that short bouts was not different than long bouts. Short bouts plus exercise equipment was not different than long bouts. Those did not differ statistically. What you can see is that the very top line is the short bout only, the middle line is the long bout, and the bottom line, the one that lost the most and kept the most off there at 18 months, is short bouts plus exercise equipment in the home. And what did differ is that short bouts plus equipment had greater weight loss at 18 months than short bouts. So having that equipment, what they found was that when they looked at their exercise amounts were more. They did more exercise than the group that didn't have the exercise equipment in the home when they looked at the short bouts versus the short bouts plus exercise. But neither one of those groups differed from the long bouts. So the good news for people who are trying to get more exercise is if there's trouble getting that longer bout of exercise, 40 minutes doesn't fit in your day, but you could break it up throughout the day, that for weight loss per se, it doesn't matter. That's what this study showed. Now, they went back and did that secondary data analysis that they had done before. So this is validating that analysis where they looked at the amount with the 3 lines there that you can see. If I can see, because my eyes are failing me, but the less than 150, the greater than 150, but less than 200, and the greater than 200. They replicated the same thing with this study that they had found in the prior study, that if you do more, people tend to do better. Now again, who are these people that are able to do the 200 minutes or more than the 200 minutes all the time? But they seem to be doing better across these studies. So how could you implement this strategy that's been found? Well, really what we need to do now is think about getting some activity on 5 days a week in order to be realistically able to get up to somewhere near 200 or 225. We can't expect to do all that on Sundays when we have some time. So we need to spread it out throughout the week and a gradual progression. You're not going to start, just like in these studies, going out and doing 225 minutes if you haven't been active. So we're going to gradually build up and add maybe 15 minutes every week. So start out doing maybe 15, the next week 30, something like that. Maybe even a little slower, maybe 10 minutes adding. There's other research that I don't have time to show today, but finding an exercise buddy improves the likelihood that you'll go. So if you have an appointment to go, it's more likely that you'll actually show up at that appointment. So maybe setting up some appointments could help. And if time is an issue, this research on short bouts suggests that doing short bouts can help you accumulate more calories burned or more exercise throughout the week, just like if you were able to set aside that longer period of time, that for your weight loss effort, that can be just as beneficial. So that's a take-home message there. So what about diet plus activity for weight loss? A recent study, this is hot off the presses in 2012, studied 439 postmenopausal women. And postmenopausal women typically have maybe slightly lower weight losses than some of the exercise studies, so it's a good group to study. And what they wanted to do was look at if you had a control group or you had a group that's doing moderate to vigorous exercise, so they're getting that 225 minutes a week, but that's what they're doing as their weight loss strategy. They're trying to tip the balance just with exercise, versus a group that's following a weight loss diet. So they're doing dietary weight loss, let's say. They're following a weight loss diet of 12 to 1,500 calories a day. They're tipping the balance only with the diet side. And then they had a group that did both. And they had weekly group meetings to help them. So they had a lot of other supports, but those were equal across all the groups. And in the groups that were doing the exercise, they had some amount of the exercise was supervised. So they knew they were getting at least 3 days that were supervised, and they were expected to do 2 of those days at home. So that was equal in the group that was doing exercise only and the group that was doing diet plus exercise. They were getting the same type of treatment. So here are the results. The control group didn't lose very much weight. And so on the left side, you see the percent weight loss. That's the percent of their body weight that they lost. And it's sort of an equalizer because someone who's heavier who loses 5 pounds is not the same as someone who's lighter who loses 5 pounds. So those percents are what we often use in obesity research to look at that. But I also put the pounds on there because sometimes it's hard. Those are the average pounds that people lost. It's sometimes hard to kind of equate that percent into a pounds number. So what you see is that the group that did the best, this is actually all these groups are statistically different than each other. This is one of those few studies where every single one of these groups is different than the other groups. It usually almost never works out in our research studies, but here they had enough power and they found that. But basically the diet plus exercise group lost about 20 pounds and that was the best. Exercise only didn't produce very much weight loss. So if we think about that as a single strategy, even though they're doing a lot of exercise, what has been found across the literature is that often it doesn't produce as much weight loss as sort of a diet plus exercise, certainly, or a diet alone. Why might that be? It's pretty hard to accumulate of like a 500 calorie deficit. So a 500 calorie deficit each day is going to help you lose about 1 pound a week. That's sort of just a marker there. So a 500 calorie bout of exercise would be like walking or running 5 miles, just as a ballpark. It's going to be different depending on your body weight, but ballpark. So if you have to make that same difference, you might be able to do that with a dietary strategy a little bit easier than with an exercise strategy. They think. The other thing is that sometimes people tend to do what's called compensation. So you go out and exercise, and then what could happen is possibly there's more eating that's going on outside of the exercise occasion. So when people are closely watching their diet plus exercising, they're keeping track. So they quantify how much. They know they're going to be able to get that deficit on the other side. So it's not to say that it can't happen with exercise. It's just a little bit harder. It has to be pretty vigilant. And the studies so far have shown small, fairly modest weight loss with exercise only. Probably because it takes a lot and then it's hard not to compensate. So, do you have to change your diet to exercise to lose weight? A study actually looked at this in what was called the Midwest Exercise Trial, and they supervised people doing their exercise. And they did the 45 minutes 5 days a week, and looked at the effects of this over 16 months. And I think the only reason I bring this study up, in case you want to look at it yourself, is that what was beneficial, these are kilograms lost, is that men in this study did quite well with exercise only as a strategy. And so we're not exactly sure why that was, but they lost about 5 kilograms compared to the controls and had significantly greater weight loss. So that would be, around 10, a little bit over 10 pounds or so, versus women who actually maintained their weight with this amount of exercise. And what they found is that during these exercise bouts of this 45 minutes that was supervised 5 days a week, women burned about 400 calories during that bout. Men burned over 600 calories during that bout. So were they getting more vigorous activity, able to do more? What was happening that was creating a different deficit? And why then didn't the women, I mean, it's a little bit puzzling, but perhaps there was compensation. There are a few other papers that have looked at the intake. But so there might be something different about that strategy, and it could be maybe a little bit more useful for men. But this is one of the only studies that's really looked at that, so I don't have a lot of good data. It's just suggestive at this point. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about self-monitoring for a few minutes, because I know it's usually a big groan when people think about having to keep track of what they're eating. Exercise is easier to keep track of. And the reason I bring it up is because it happens to be one of the most consistent findings across the literature. People typically say, well, in these weight loss studies, what is a good predictor of outcome? And one of the things that over and above becomes a strong predictor of outcome, correlated around 0.5 in many of my studies or so, is the amount and the consistency that people keep track of their diet. And there are a number of reasons for this. The other thing that starts to come up is is how frequently they keep track, and it's typically on the diet side. The exercise side, like I said, is a little bit easier to do, and it doesn't seem to matter how they keep track, whether they're using a paper diary, more electronic diaries, maybe new gadgets or other things, but they're keeping track of those calories. And we think that it's because you're able to more quantify whether or not the tipping that energy balance is actually happening, whether the deficit is happening, because sort of eyeballing food and guessing how much calories might be in something without weighing and measuring it has not borne out very well as a strategy for trying to measure or meet those calorie goals. So the more frequently people do it, and they actually did a study where they put electronic sensors in those paper diaries. So did a study, brought people in, handed out paper diaries, and had an electronic sensor that was sensitive to light that would record every time that diary was opened and closed, okay? And they actually found an amazing association that some people, when they came back to the weight loss group at the end of the week, would fill out that diary right before the group session. Amazingly, that is also helpful, but not as helpful as the people who were filling it out each day during the week, and actually filling it out closer to that eating occasion or that meal occasion was even stronger. So it's almost this very, very consistent association between keeping track and doing it close to the meal occasion. Why might that be? We forget, more accurate. And also, if you fill it out and you know how many calories at meal 1, you can make a more informed choice at meal 2 and another more informed choice at meal 3, as opposed to sort of looking back over the week and thinking, well, how did I do overall, and trying to quantify those amounts. So it's an important strategy, and one that is hard, but we're trying different approaches to help people with that. One of those approaches is letting people use electronic apps, or recording their exercise using we use the Body Media armband, so recording all of their activity at least, so they could see the activity side of the equation. So there's lots of ways that can be done. Old-fashioned writing it down is also good, and studies really haven't shown a huge difference between electronic and paper as of yet. I think some of our electronic means are getting better and better. So be honest and consistent. So that's been shown. So newer research is focusing on another way of monitoring. And this is a little bit easier. It's weighing. And in the older literature, people were not as straightforward with how frequently people should weigh themselves. And in fact, I've even seen campaigns and advertisements on TV suggesting that people should just throw their scales out the window, and that we shouldn't focus on body weight. And so I'm going to tell you about some newer research. Some of those randomized trials that are sort of our gold standard are going on right now. So some of this is analysis like that exercise data of what people are doing. So we need to learn a little bit more from some of the randomized trials, but I'll show you some of this data. And these come from 2 studies that were done in the literature looking at the differences in weight loss programs whether or not people are weighing daily, weekly, or monthly. And you can see in two separate studies sort of a very, and the reason that it looks slightly different on the right-hand side is that's body mass index change. That study didn't have kilograms or pounds change. But every 1 unit of BMI is roughly 5 pounds or so. And that second study on the right-hand side was a very low-intensity study. So those weight losses were smaller overall. But what you see is that what we call a linear relationship. The less frequently you weigh, monthly, the lowest weight losses, weekly in the middle, and daily weighers lost the most weight across both of these studies. This is another study done with young adults that replicates the same finding in a weight loss program and really shows that those people who were weighing daily, and these other studies were not in young adults per se, but across sort of this age spectrum, we're seeing the same pattern. It's almost an amazing pattern with the less frequent, monthly, not doing as well to daily. We just recently did a secondary analysis of one of our weight loss studies. This is a study that I did with a doctoral student. We presented this data. We haven't published the study yet, but we had a measure where it asked people whether they were weighing themselves rarely or sometimes, or always or often. And the lighter bar is the people that are weighing themselves always or often, and the darker bar is those that are weighing rarely or sometimes. And at both 6 and 12 months, those are percent weight losses again. So you can just see the pattern there. Those are not pounds. And then finally, we did another study where we actually, this was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, where we had a weight loss maintenance intervention. So people came into our study and had already lost weight, and we're trying to help them keep that weight off over the next 18 months. And we developed an intervention for that. And what happened was there were two groups of the intervention, a group that got all of their intervention over the internet and another group that got their intervention face-to-face, but they received the same intervention, it was just the delivery was different. And then we had a control group that didn't get those recommendations. And in this study, people were taught how to use the scale, as imperfect as it can be, as an instrument or a tool to help them. So they were taught what to make of those different fluctuations, and each day to be able to look at that pattern and make a decision about what behavior they should do. Did they need to reinstitute watching their calories? Did they need to bump up their exercise? They were taught a very specific system. And this is based on what we call self-regulation theory. And so the two groups, the internet and the face-to-face group, received all of that package which taught them about how to use the information on the scale to make these changes. And what you see is that daily weighers in the light bar in the control group who were not taught anything, daily weighing made no difference for them. But the groups that were taught how to use the information on their scale to make adjustments, so that energy balance adjustments by using the scale information to guide them, in both the internet and the face-to-face group, they showed much better maintenance over the 18 months. So using the scale and what's on the scale to guide those behavioral choices we think is very important. And figuring out what to do based on patterns of weight trajectory. One of my doctoral students, I can't present all of this data here, but she just got her paper accepted in obesity, developed a whole intervention where instead of writing everything down, people weighed themselves every day. And we used a scale that Bluetooth through the cellular network, actually, Bluetooth to the cell phone, and then through the cell phone sent the weight automatically to the internet where we could see the graphs. And each week we sent an email with feedback about how this strategy was working and what they might try to do differently. People lost very, very good amount of weight in her intervention group, and that was the only self-monitoring they did, was every day weighing themselves, seeing if their weight went up, they needed to make a change because what they had done before, and this kind of goes against what we typically think about because we know that those calorie deficits need to accumulate over a week or so to create that 3,500 calorie deficit that creates a pound lost. But just knowing what I'm doing is kind of working or not working for me and I need to make an adjustment tomorrow or the next time was enough information for people to lose weight, and they lost quite a bit of weight. We also found in a secondary analysis, again, of looking back at those people who did it every day, because we now knew objectively, because their weight came automatically to our database, people who did it 7 days out of the week lost over 10% weight loss. So for somebody who started out at 200 pounds, they would have lost 20 pounds over the course of this 6-month intervention. Just weighing themselves every day and making adjustments to their dietary intake and their physical activity based on what they see on the scale. So for people that have difficulty writing everything down, keeping close tabs on that weight may be an important new strategy that we're just starting to learn more about. It's actually an old strategy, but one that went out of favor for a while. So why might daily weighing be important? We think it's because it allows people to make daily adjustments to affect energy balance. And more frequent weighing in some of these secondary data analysis has been associated with lower fat intake, more walking, increases in self-monitoring. People do start to write down more when they're weighing more. They're kind of doing a general overall positive set of behaviors, and more dietary restraint, which actually in weight control studies is a good predictor of success. So how could you implement this recommendation? Weigh every day on the same scale. Weigh first thing in the morning under the same conditions. So you don't want to weigh one day before you eat breakfast and the next day after you eat breakfast or drink, morning water or coffee. And keep a graph of your weight and look for patterns. We want people to use that number, not worry about what the number is, but use the number as an indicator. And so in our weight control programs, we talk about using it like a gas gauge in your car. When you look at the gas gauge, you don't make judgments about yourself, right? If you need to go get gas, people don't say, I'm a terrible person, I'm going to run out of gas. But oftentimes when people step on the scale, they have a value judgment about what their weight says about them. And so we do a lot of work on trying to make peace with the scale or sort of demystify the number. It's just an indicator. Like your pants can be an indicator of whether what you're doing for diet and exercise is working, the number on the scale can be an indicator. Or like your temperature. Does it tell you you have a fever and you might be sick or not? It doesn't tell you you're a terrible person or anything like that. So we do a lot of work psychologically around this so that people could use this information to make better choices or make different adjustments to their diet and exercise. Okay, so these things I've mentioned are not new, they're not earth-shattering, but they might be easier said than done in sort of this environment that we live in. So I'm going to mention a few things which are evidence-based and the reason why they're built into many of the weight control programs that are delivered. These are some evidence-based additional strategies. They might be surprising to you, they might not. But there's been a good bit of research that shows that portion-controlled meals during weight loss result in better weight loss, both short and long term. So what's a portion-controlled meal? Like a lean cuisine or even a liquid Slim Fast, Special K, they have some of those different ones, or the food. So a Lean Cuisine, a Smart One, or Jenny Craig, Nutrisystem, any of the places where you can purchase the food in pre-portioned amounts. So portion control, the rationale for this is that many people don't like to do what we talked about, self-monitoring, right? Oftentimes it's very challenging. People don't like to do it. So one way to be sure that we can have our intake in the amount that's going to produce weight loss is to eat some portion-controlled meals. It reduces errors, guesswork, and when people are using these products, they're typically not eating out because they've already purchased the food and they have it at home and it's pretty easy. They don't have to stop. So there's a lot of reasons why it's good. But there's also some research behind it. This is a study that was done by my mentor, the person who I worked with for many years, Dr. Rena Wing. And what they did in this study is they had a control group, and they randomized people to the control group, a standard weight loss program where people came in and were given calorie recommendations and exercise, a standard weight loss program plus financial incentives to lose weight. That was one group. We're not really focusing on that here. And a group that got the standard weight loss program plus they got food provided to them in the 1,200 to 1,500 calorie amount. So you came into the weight loss program and you were given a box of food to take home that was yours to eat for the week. Okay? So what you see on the graph is the weight losses of all the groups, and it's a little bit hard to see, but the bottom line is that both groups that got the food provision, so there was another group that got food provision plus incentives, I forgot to mention that. Both the food provision and the food provision plus incentives lost the most weight in the study. Okay? So they went on to do study 2, where they said, okay, well, providing people with food is going to be expensive and not really something we can do readily within programs very easily. So let's do another one where we give people a calorie-controlled menu of all the portions and exactly what to eat. So tell you what to eat for all those days instead of handing you the food. So one group got the standard behavioral, one group got the standard behavioral plus they got a menu with everything they're supposed to eat, exactly laid out for them in portions. Another group got the standard behavioral, but they had to pay for their food because they wondered in the other group, was it because we handed them the food, right? That could have been the reason why it worked better. You got the food, it was free, you had it. So they made them buy it in this group. That was kind of a tough group to be in. And then they had the group that got the food again. So they had the standard behavioral plus the food that was given to them. And what they found was that all the groups that received the menus, the purchased food, or the free food did the same and better than the groups that didn't get the menus. They got a standard behavioral weight loss program, they got the recommendations to watch their calories, they got the same recommendations, they got the same group meetings and all those things. So they found that the menus, having exactly what to eat for some people, enhanced their weight losses as much as handing them the food and giving them the food, which is why in many programs they'll offer an alternative for people to use a menu to actually follow what's on the menu. All those reasons we talked about food provision takes the guesswork out. You know what to eat, it's there, it's purchased, it's done. All those reasons, it's pre-measured, you have it, all those reasons for why the 12 to 1,500 calories are more likely to be eaten in those amounts than when people are trying to estimate and guess and do all that other work. So menus are generally, they look like this. You find them all over the place. There's lots of them on the internet. You can find them for any type of dietary preferences you have, so they can be a good strategy. Here's a study where they did a meal replacement in the form of a shake. So many people don't like the shakes or the kind of liquid meals. They don't think they work so well. So here's a study that was done where they randomized people to get a weight loss diet of 12 to 1,500 calories with conventional food, that's what the CF is, so eat conventional food, versus meal replacements. So generally, meal replacements in order to achieve that 12 to 1,500 calorie deficit. In the beginning phase, they were given meal replacements for 2 meals and 2 snacks. And that's what the weight losses were over the first 4 months. The ones who were given the meal replacements, the 2 meals and the 2 snacks, did better than the group that was given the calorie-controlled diet but told to eat conventional food. Okay, so again, another study that showed evidence that providing those portion-controlled amounts, even if they're in liquid amounts, that they lost more weight. What happened in the second phase of the study is that the group that got conventional food was then given meal replacements for 1 meal a day, and the other group was told to use meal replacements for 1 meal a day, because they thought this could be a maintenance strategy, right? It's hard to follow this and use a meal replacement for all meals, but what if you just had a lean cuisine for lunch? That's it. Simple, one thing. Have something, make your own at home if you want organic, make your own, put it in portion-controlled container in the freezer, take it with you, have it for lunch. They found that it helped as a maintenance strategy, and the group that was on conventional food, when they switched them to 1 meal replacement a day, actually started to lose additional weight and then maintained and kept that weight off. And this is long-term evidence. This is out to 51 months. So people were continuing to follow this strategy over time. Not a lot of replications of these studies, but one of the thoughts and inclinations that we have is to let people maybe have soup for lunch. It's a pre-portioned something, one as a weight maintenance or weight gain prevention strategy. 1 meal replacement or portion controlled type of meal per day. There's evidence for it. So implementing the strategy, if you want to do it as a weight loss strategy, it would be important to substitute 2 meals and to have some snacks that are pre-portioned so that you would know that you were getting about the number of calories that would help you to lose weight. And you could use that and then consume a healthful, portion-controlled dinner for dinner. This is where the Slim Fast plan came from. So some of this recommendation, 2 portion-controlled meals with a healthy dinner. So it may not be for everyone, but for people who aren't going to keep track, want simple, want convenient, might be a strategy that they could implement and use. So there's been some recent research. We've recommended this for a long time, but we didn't have really good evidence that slowing your rate of eating during a meal could be useful. It was just something that people sort of recommended, that people needed to slow down. I know, I have 3 kids. I know that especially during the young ages of my kids, my rate of eating has sped up over the years because I wanted to wolf down my food so that I could then go on to whatever other child rearing was going to need to go on. So I'm now trying to slow back down again. Sorry for moving all around. So there's actually a new study where they just randomize people to eat quickly or to eat slowly over the study. And the duration of the quick meal was about 8.6 minutes. And the duration of the slow meal was 30 minutes. They were eating the same amount of food. The amount of food consumed, you can see in the energy intake, which I've shaded, was significantly different in the 2 groups. The group that ate the meal, they were served the same amount, that ate the meal over 30 minutes, ate 579 calories, and the other group ate 646 calories. So if that were to happen to you each night at dinner, that would be a sizable difference in calories over time, something that could help with maintaining weight or something that could help with losing weight. So it's one study. They found no difference in how satisfied the groups were with their meal, and in fact there was a slight indication on this next slide. Actually, the significant difference in what's called satiety, or how satisfied or satiated the person was, it seemed to be that there was greater satiety in the slow eating group. So again, back to this idea that slowing down, they encourage them to put their fork down, take a sip of water, slow down their rate of eating. It's a strategy we've heard about for many years, but until we saw this study, we weren't sure that there was a whole lot of research behind this study, behind this strategy. So implementing, using smaller utensils, taking smaller bites, putting the fork down, setting a timer. So sometimes training people like me who are now used to eating fast, maybe having a timer and really purposefully, mindfully trying to slow down. It's not something that happens automatically for people. So that may be a way to help people do that. Some research that we've been very interested in doing some work on in our lab recently is on limiting caloric beverage consumption. So if you look at this next slide, the amount of calories in the typical American diet that is coming from beverages is quite astounding. This is on average the amount of calories per day found in this study by Dr. Popkin, who's also in our Department of Nutrition, and Kaya Duffy, that was published in 2007. 350 calories from alcohol, 300 calories, I can barely read it, from soda. Fruit drinks, you can see the numbers there. So a lot of calories per day coming from caloric beverages. So we reasoned with a rationale that many adults, these are averages, and actually in the South, compared to some other regions of the country, our average caloric intake from beverages per day in adults is quite high. It's among the highest. And we have things like sweet tea and some other beverages that contribute a fair amount of calories. So we reasoned that many adults consume caloric beverage and that these beverages really provide no nutritional value. Other than unsweetened milk, which does provide nutritional value, many of these beverages provide no nutritional value. And so reducing caloric beverage intake should reduce in modest weight loss for those who consume them, right? So if you don't drink that many calories, it should help people to lose weight. But really, these benefits will only accrue if people don't compensate or go out and eat something else in place of those calories that they saved when they had the beverage. So we really didn't know if this would work. It works in theory. Now, we published a paper this year in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition where we randomized people to one of 3 groups. Our purpose was to determine whether replacing caloric beverages with non-caloric alternatives, either water or diet beverages, would provide a simple strategy to help people lose weight and improve some of their health profile over 6 months. So we assigned them to one group that served as an attention control. They got everything, all the same amount of time, contact with our therapists, our interventionists, etc. access to a website. Another group was randomized to a diet beverage intervention, and another group to water. They were going to replace with water. So what we recommended was to replace 2 or more servings per day, which would be about 200 calories, with either the water or the diet beverage, depending on which group you got randomized to. So they were randomly assigned, and they didn't have a choice of which one of these drinks they wanted to drink. And we provided them. So every month, people would come to our center, and I would send them home with 8 cases of their beverage of choice, their water or their sparkling water. They could have only like Deer Park sparkling with no aspartame or no artificial sweeteners. They could have a little bit of bubbly water if they wanted to in the straight water group, but it was not sweetened water. And in the beverage group, diet beverages, they could choose from a list of beverages. We weren't partial to one Coke, Pepsi, whatever you wanted. You picked from the website and we ordered it for you every month and you took it home. You could have carbonated, non-carbonated, caffeinated, non-caffeinated, you pick. We sent you home with 8 cases of diet beverages. We did this to make sure that you had adequate beverages to substitute for those caloric beverages that you were consuming. So what we found was that participants reduced intake of caloric beverages and increased the consumption of the non-caloric beverages. They decreased their calories by about 216 calories across the beverage groups, but that declined over time. So initially, people were really doing well, and then their adherence kind of slipped toward the 6 months. So we followed them at 3 and 6 months. The diet beverage groups showed somewhat better adherence to the recommendation and a likelihood of achieving a 5% weight loss better than our control group at 6 months. When we looked at the overall weight change results of the 3 groups, we found that there were not significant differences on the means, but that your odds of achieving a significant weight loss, everybody achieved about between 1.75 in the controls and 2.5 in the diet beverage % weight loss. So about 5 pounds on average for those groups and about 3 pounds for the controls that were coming in and were taught portion control and lots of other things besides beverages. So they were making changes too, mostly on the food intake side. They made no changes to beverages. So we think it's a simple strategy. Your odds of achieving a 5% weight loss, which has been associated with improvements in blood pressure and lots of other things, were significantly greater, 2 times greater odds if you were in the beverage groups. So there was some benefit to being randomized to the beverage groups. And we just are getting ready to publish a paper where we looked at whether or not you were a sweet liker based on a sweet preference test that we did at baseline. You had to spit from different graduated sucrose solutions. You had to taste them on average 5 times each over 25 times, rate how much you like them, all these different things to look at whether or not you were a sweet liker or a non-sweet liker. And it looks like that the sweet likers tended to do better if they were randomized to the diet beverage group than if they were randomized to the water group. So it took the water group a little bit of time to sort of adjust to drinking water when they were giving up sugar-sweetened beverages, but they tended to start to do better after 3 months. So we wonder what's happening there, and we're doing some additional studies to look at that. So how could you implement the strategy? I think it would be a way to substitute non-caloric beverages for caloric beverages, but it's important to be careful not to compensate by adding other things to the diet if this is going to be a weight control strategy. So there's some new research looking at drinking water before each meal. And it shows that if you drink water before each meal when you're following a weight-controlled diet, you tend to do better in a weight loss program. So this is a randomized study where they did what was called a water preload. So they randomized people to either have a weight loss diet or have a weight loss diet plus the recommendation to drink 16 ounces of water within about 30 minutes of each meal. And what they found is you can see here the group on the left losing weight without the preload, and the group on the right losing weight with the preload. The group that drank the water about 30 minutes prior to each meal while following a calorie-controlled diet lost more weight than the group that was not following the water preload. So these are some simple strategies that may help people to reduce their overall calorie intake when they're trying to follow a weight loss diet. So you might implement this recommendation by drinking a 16-ounce water bottle, something like this, prior to lunch or dinner, prior to breakfast, as a strategy to help you if you're trying to watch calorie intake. Okay, so I'm almost done here. Changing the home environment. I mentioned a lot about that toxic environment and what could you do to change your home environment. It would make sense that if you tried to modify your home environment to be more positive, that could help you or cue you to do those things like they were doing at the Biggest Loser Ranch, perhaps. So the reason and the rationale behind this is kind of hearkening us back to the bakery, but like when you go to the movie theater and you have popcorn every time you go to the movie theater, it creates an association, okay? And then the next time you might go to the movie theater and have popcorn, or this is just as easily in your home watching TV, and you have something to eat, it's creating an association. And this bond or this association over time becomes strong. And it's called a cue. And essentially that cue of doing the same thing in the same environment is a pretty strong cue to do those things again. And so changing that or breaking that over time is one of the things that can help people to break those habits, is changing how those happen. So we think about that in people's home environment as maybe changing up some of the things that are going on within the home that might be cueing them in certain ways, or implementing other strategies. This is really important. Things like if you always come home and have a snack and you're trying to watch your intake, we recommend that people might change that. Maybe come home and do something else, go for a walk, or try to do something incompatible with eating to break that time or that habit. Or coming home and having a drink after work or something like that they might want to limit to try to break that habit to do something different. So a research study called LEAP, the Lifestyle Eating and Activity Program, kind of tried to take this to see whether this would improve overall weight loss, to really change things in the home environment. And I used to work with Amy Gorin at Brown University when I was there. She's now at the University of Connecticut, and she published a study recently looking at whether or not if you change people's home environment, does it improve their overall weight loss when they're in a standard behavioral program. And so she randomized people, 201 overweight and obese adults, to a standard behavioral program or the standard behavioral program with direct manipulation of their home environment. And the kinds of things that they changed are on this next slide. They wanted to help really make a lot of these changes we've been talking about, modify the type and portion sizes of foods consumed in the home. And so they subscribed them to healthy eating magazines. They tried to keep them out of the grocery store by ordering all their foods through an online grocery delivery so they wouldn't be queued in the grocery stores. They had them order from Peapod. It's a grocery delivery in the Northeast, and you ordered all your foods online ahead of time. They wanted to modify the availability of exercise equipment, so following on that Jakisic study, gave them a treadmill in the home. They wanted to increase the saliency of the consequences. So this is a big part of behavioral weight control by having scales and full-length mirrors, doing all those things in the home. And then they wanted to create a positive environment of social support by having a partner to participate. They also gave them different sized dishes, so replaced all their home dishes with smaller sized bowls, cups, plates. So really changing up that home environment to cue people and to try to do some different things. Had magazines delivered that were positive cues and a variety of other strategies. Does this sound like it might work to enhance weight loss? So they did this over and above the standard behavioral program. People are coming in every week, and we know that these standard behavioral programs work quite well. So what they found is that at 6 months, the group that got the home environment manipulation lost 9.1 kilograms, so multiply that by 2.2, so about 20 pounds compared to 6.8, and this was statistically different compared to the group that's in the standard behavioral program alone. But what happened was, over time, those differences did not remain statistically significant. So over 18 months, those kind of initial changes, I'm not going to say they wore off. They still lost 1.8 kilograms more at the end, but the statistical significance wasn't there. And results, importantly, differed by gender. Women tended to do well in the standard behavioral plus home environment. Men did quite well in standard behavioral alone, so they didn't benefit as much from the spousal support and the spousal participation as the women tended to in her study. But they had a very small number of men, so that finding needs to be replicated. Oops. Okay, so we were doing a lot of these strategies, and I don't have any of my Kannapolis participants here, I don't think, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we recruited 195 adults here in your community and conducted a weight loss program where we had people coming in once a month for a group in this room, about 100 people in one group, and over in the other building with smaller groups of about 20. We were looking at group size as a supplement to an all-internet program. So a lot of my research focuses on using the internet and how we can use other technologies to get what we do and we know works out to people that can't access those treatments, maybe in rural areas or other places. And what we did is met with everybody once a month here and then had them using the internet program in between. And we did this for 4 months. And we taught a lot of the same strategies we've talked about tonight over time and had a number of different ways to implement that, had counselors to help on the online program, et cetera. And we had a web program they could use that was also giving them 4 text messages a week that would cue, that were positive cues and reminders and things like that that could be beneficial for motivation. And so far, we are analyzing all the data so far, but some of our losers lost up to 51.5 pounds. That was the most weight lost. And one person gained about 9.35 pounds. So there's always a range in these studies. The average we're still looking at, and I can't mention to you yet because we're still in the process of writing up the publication, but in general, both of our 2 groups, in the smaller group and the larger group, did well and we measured a number of other health beneficial markers like their glucose and their blood pressure and other things like that. So we're still working on those findings, but we really appreciate the opportunity to come here and work with residents in this community and are excited to hopefully continue some of that work in the future. So I'm just going to end with secrets to keeping it off. This is from the National Weight Control Registry that's been studied in scientific publications and also in People magazine. These are people who have lost weight successfully and then kept it off over time. This is sort of that elusive weight loss maintenance. People can lose it, but can they really keep it off? And there's a lot of publications. If you're interested, you can go to the National Weight Control Registry's website. They now have an N in the registry of over 10,000 people that they're following. And in order to be in the registry, you have to have lost weight successfully. So the entry criteria are to have lost, I think it's around 30 pounds or so, and kept that weight off for at least a year. And then they follow you, and the average weight loss is very much higher than that. It's almost 50 pounds, and the average maintenance is now at, let's see, somebody's out to 66 years, but the average is about 6 years so far in the registry. And what they're doing is annually sending assessments to these individuals to study and understand what's making them so successful. And one of the things that they're finding is a lot of those things I mentioned for weight loss, the people who are successfully keeping their weight loss are doing the same behaviors. They are following a low-fat, low-calorie diet. The average calorie consumption is somewhere in the 1,300, I believe, calories per day. They are still doing a lot of physical activity, 60 to 90 minutes per day, so getting that 225. Weighing frequently, so weighing several times per week. Some are weighing daily, but several times per week on average. And maintaining consistency of the diet are just a few of the findings. But so in general, what that means is they don't really eat differently on the weekends or holidays than they do most of the days. So they don't have a lot of breaks where they decide, oh, I'm just going to really eat quite differently today or even on a weekly basis. They eat pretty consistently over time. They have high quality of life. People think, oh, this could be a miserable way to live. And so they've looked at their quality of life. They're doing a lot of exercise, pretty consistent, eating low calories, and they do have very high quality of life over time, and there's lots of things that they've learned about what are the things that predict regain over time. So it's a very interesting resource, but I think the take-home message is doing those things for weight loss are the same things that are making people successful to keep that weight off. We have one other big study now on prevention of weight gain in young adults 18 to 35. And one of the things we're doing is talking about using the scale and doing a high amount of physical activity as prevention, and then looking at what changes to the diet would need to be made only in the event of small weight gains, so catching those weight gains early. Other things they learned from the registry, which is kind of the final point, is that most people in the registry report having tried to lose weight several times prior to their quote-unquote successful weight loss attempt. So we usually mention this to our participants because people think, oh, I just might not have it in me. I might not be able to do this. But you know, your mother always said, well, if you don't succeed at first, try again. And that's what people in the registry did, and it's kind of one of those positive messages that maybe there's something about this time or setting up that environment for success or getting other outside supports or other things that make it more likely that somebody can do this in the end and then keep that weight off long term. So with that, I'll take any questions, and I thank you for your attention.